Jose Marino will speak on assessment of Neurology's implementation of equity, diversity, and inclusion editorial review of research manuscripts.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to present this work on behalf of my colleagues, an assessment of Neurology's implementation of equity, diversity, and inclusion reviews during the editorial process. In 2019, Neurology published a humanities article that contained several racial stereotypes. The article was immediately retracted. The editors expressed deep regret that this had been published and implemented several changes to the journal's processes to make sure that something like this would not happen again. I have to say the steps were done very quickly and has led to a big changes in how we do things in the journal. Among these changes was the appointment of Drs. Holly Hinson and Roy Hamilton as EDI associate editors. Both are academic neurologists with active research careers, but with a long-standing interest on EDI issues. The objective of having the EDI editors was to assist authors and editors in ensuring that the content of the published manuscript is respectful and affirming to all populations. And EDI editors would review articles whose primary outcomes or key covariates are social demographic factors, including but not limited to issues like race and ethnicity. I don't know, this is changing. The process and time course for EDI review has changed slightly since the position was created. And currently, EDI editors review manuscripts that an associate editor and the editor-in-chief think that are suitable for neurology if appropriately revised, and they could be considered acceptable for publication. The reason for inserting it at this late stage has to do with the fact that it's a very time-consuming process, and we don't want to, one, delay decisions, and two, that the number of papers involved would be a lot. How can I move this back? This is, okay. Papers that need EDI review are identified by the associate editor, by the editor-in-chief, or by any member of staff at any point during the review process. And recently, I've had a lot of papers in the later stages where staff members going through, getting ready and saying, you know what, there's something here that needs an EDI review. So everybody's empowered to do that. The objective of this study was to describe the outcomes of the EDI review process over the first months of the process and highlight the issues that were identified by the EDI editors. We took a random selection of 75 research articles that were submitted to Neurology between May 2019 and December 2021, and that were reviewed by an EDI editor. 2 raters evaluated each initial EDI review, and we had to identify if an EDI issues were raised by the EDI reviewer and then classify them either by the type of concern, and this is, does this have to do with the terms used and a lot of the issues that were presented in the last presentation, or does this have to do with conceptual issues in how the study was framed? And then also the category of marginalization that it applies to, which would be race, ethnicity, sex, gender, or other. We used descriptive statistics, and we identified the themes that were raised by consensus of the different raters. Here are some examples of terminology issues. Using outdated terms for identity groups, using sex and gender interchangeably, using obsolete terms such as Caucasian or not capitalizing group names, and using group category names as nouns rather than as adjectives, for example, saying that Blacks are at high risk as opposed to Black patients are at high risk, would be terminology issues. Some conceptual issues would be the use of pejorative assertions or assumptions about groups, having race presented as a biological variable rather than as a social construct, ignoring the contribution of structural and social demographic factors to disparities, that are not being adequately emphasized, not providing a context why race was actually studied in the paper, not clarifying how race or ethnicity were determined and differentiated, and then conflating race with ancestry. We reviewed, in the time period under study, we had almost 8,000 research articles submitted to Neurology, and of these, only 101 were reviewed by an EDI editor. Again, these were identified by the associate editor, the editor-in-chief, or any member of staff. We selected 75 at random based on the name of the EDI reviewer on our database, but then we found that 3 of them, the EDI reviewer had reviewed them as a topic expert, not as an EDI review. So our analysis was limited to 72 papers. And in 61 of these, there was at least one EDI concern identified. When we look at the type of concerns, in more than half of the papers, the EDI concern related to racial or ethnic concepts, terms, or both. In 16%, sex or gender only. And most papers had both conceptual and terminology concerns. The concern was conceptual overall in 26% of papers, terminology only in 16% of papers, and as mentioned, more than half had concerns in both. And here are some examples of comments by EDI reviewers. This one has that in a manuscript that centers on race and racial difference in the given disease, the author should consider adding more framing and context that helps readers understand what race represents and how the nature of race informs their findings. Another one is, what's the basis of determining whether patients are Black or white? And we ask for further clarification. Here's one that the authors speculate that there may be an inherent molecular or genetic variation that impart a risk of a given outcome in African American versus white patients. Given the weight of evidence that Black persons in the US experience socially mediated disparities in all manner of health outcomes compared to the paucity of evidence supporting intrinsic biologically relevant differences between Black and white people, the EDI reviewers suggested either discussing the notion of inherent differences with a great deal of circumspection or not at all in the paper, so as to avoid having the reader draw conclusions that any differences were biologically based. And finally, placing that context, it seems to me that the authors could do more to explain to the reader why it was important to look at how these two complex constructs interact in the first place. Currently, the stated rationale for looking at race as interactions in the introduction is essentially that no one has looked at this before, but that does not really explain why the authors would have expected to find an interaction. So we're asking, it's more than just saying the terminology, we're asking the authors to actually explain the rationale for doing the research the way they did it when they're looking at these variables. When we looked at the concerns identified by consensus, we found that there were factual errors or misrepresentation of facts regarding marginalized groups. There was insufficient methodological specificity regarding the nature of how EDI variables were conceptualized or determined, insufficient acknowledgement of student limitations regarding EDI-related issues, non-affirming assertions and descriptions of marginalized groups, including the use of obsolete terminology or biased language, framing issues, such as the one we talked about, race being a biological variable, or terminology confusion between sex and gender and race and ethnicity. Now, what happened with this? Well, when looking at the acceptance rate of manuscripts, we found that most of the papers where an EDI editor identified at least one concern were ultimately accepted to the journal, compared to 55% of those without concern. The fact that the acceptance rate is similar for both groups tells us that the authors were able to successfully address these issues that were raised by the EDI reviewer, and that gives us confidence that the process has been useful and helpful. In conclusion, we say that most papers flagged for EDI review had several conceptual and nomenclature issues spanning various themes. The fact that the proportion of rejected papers was the same when EDI concerns were identified suggests that the authors were able to address the concerns raised. And we think that the implementation of EDI review led to the identification and correction related to categories of marginalization in papers published in Neurology. So with that, I'm open for any question or further discussion.
Hi, Jose. This is Kirsten Patrick from the CMAJ.
Hello.
I loved your talk and great work there. I just have two small questions. The one is, are you going to be publishing a policy about what to expect, the way that JAMA has?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
And the second question is, so reflecting on this talk and the one that came before, where you saw a reasonable acceptance rate of articles where an issue had been identified. Do you think that journals then act as a correcting influence on the way that researchers are thinking about ethnicity and,
you're muted.
and sex and gender?
I believe so.
It says mute under the microphone.
Yeah.
So two things in terms of policy,
Great.
we
I
do
certainly
state in
put it
our
down to
instructions
the
for authors, for
lowest.
example, that we follow the
You know,
AMA recommendations in
So
terms of
this-
we also have had several editorials actually explaining our EDI
See,
review process and what
it's
we
like
look
saying no sound. Hello.
and the role of our EDI
Muffin?
reviewers. I do think that
Oh, I
medical
thought you were
journals
here.
can play a role in terms of moving the field
Hey.
with this regard.
Muffin?
And anecdotally, our EDI reviewers have told us that they've noticed a shift
You're
in terms
very
of
grateful
some of
for
the
eye drops.
issues that they have to address in the papers that they've been receiving more recently. Whether it's because it's the same authors or whether it's because the message is been getting through and percolating, I don't know what it is. But I mean, medical journals, I think, do have a role. I mean, an example is trial registration, right? Where medical journals were the ones who implemented policies way ahead of the FDA or anybody else. So I think we do have a role to play.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Jose. Thanks for that talk. I'm Mark from BMJ. I've got sort of two questions. One, for the sort of EDI editors, would they only look at research, or would they perhaps also look at other article content for the journal and flag up issues, or is it primarily, would they kind of only be referred to look at sort of research articles and look at that content? And the kind of second sort of comment is around kind of having EDI editors, I think is great. Is there ever the fear that almost the kind of EDI would then fall to sit solely in their court and almost perhaps absolve the actual handling editor of anything to do with the kind of EDI on a paper, or is that ever a kind of concern?
So, yeah, so regarding the second one, the EDI editors are often involved in the paper when an associate editor or I have identified an issue. So everybody, I think, is thinking about these concerns. And the associate editors will sometimes make those comments to the authors, but we found that it's very helpful when we have EDI review, one, to make sure that we're being uniform in terms of how we do it, but two, also the degree of, as you can see on the examples, I mean, the EDI editors are not saying you really should do this, but they're actually going to long discussions as to what this is, and I've actually encouraged them, and they're working on a longer manuscript in terms of those issues. Now, the first question, I didn't quite understand what the point was.
Yeah, so would EDI editors, they're mainly looking at how to sort of edit and correct the text in research, but also would they potentially look at kind of non-article or non-research content on neurology as well?
So the EDI editors are currently looking at research submissions.
Yeah.
When we have a submission that deals with an aspect that's related to EDI or that we think has concerns, we still ask them to look at that. But that's not their primary remit.
Sure. Thanks. Cheers.
Michael.
Thank you. I'm going to combine several questions from Annabelle Landon, Bahar Mimani, and Christine Casey. The first is, what qualifications do you ask the EDI editors to have, background, training, and so on? Who evaluates their performance? And an unrelated question is that the article that was retracted that prompted the establishment of the EDI positions is no longer available. And can you share your thoughts about taking down that kind of offensive content versus keeping it up for educational purposes?
Right. So in terms of the EDI editors, both editors we currently have had been involved in the field of EDI for many years. They're either deans or vice deans or for EDI at their institutions, and it's something they've been working in, and it's a big part of their professional life. I think they're evaluated by the editor-in-chief, really, who's basically I'm evaluating how the performance is going, but we don't have a formal method of doing that. Now, regarding the paper not being available or not, that was a decision made before I came on. I think that paper that was such an egregious collection of racial offenses that it got taken down. Now, whether it should be up or not, I mean, I think it's open for discussion. I think that it's so egregious that I'm not sure we want to share it.
Thank you.
But I'm sure there's other opinions.
Malik Kumar, Stanford University, but actually here promoting EASE, European Association of Science Editor, where we developed sort of peer review toolkit and materials to guide reviewers. So many journals do not have resources to hire an extra reviewer that would look on a specific issue. So do you have templates for sentences that your reviewers used or that you could maybe develop that could help reviewers address these things? When we see a black, white person versus African-American, things like that, are there examples that your reviewers, is there like a practical guidebook rather than the guidelines themselves that are often not in a practical sense, how to write that comment to the author? So I've detected this should be fixed in this way.
Right. So the challenge here is there's two types of things. One has to do with some of the terminology, how the terms are used, how they're expressed, and actually the guidance in the editorial that we spoke on just in the talk immediately preceding this actually has very practical advice in that regard in terms of how to implement those issues. The harder one has to do with more of the conceptual issues, and I'm not sure that that can be checklisted, but I mean, I could talk to our EDI editors and see if they think they could develop a checklist to share for other journals, because I think this is something important that we'll have to collaborate with them. So we'll look at that.
Yes, my name is Leonard Jack Jr. I'm editor-in-chief of CDC's journal, Preventing Chronic Disease. And anytime I hear these talks, I'm always thinking about how we're always trying to help researchers, right? Bring the DEI lens to their work. Someone mentioned earlier that if it were not for the hands at within the journal touching the papers, then some of the papers wouldn't bring that. But I always try to find myself thinking about, once we position papers to be publishable and they bring the DEI lens, how does that translate into the world being different and doing things very differently? For example, how do we translate guidelines, tips to practitioners, healthcare providers that will hopefully create the care that's necessary to improve health, that aligns with all the things that we're trying to get authors to convey in their work, that demonstrates respect, inclusion, and all of that, and how to bring these two worlds together, right? And I don't know if you have an answer to that. I know for our journal, we're asking authors to answer the so what question. So you've gotten your paper, but at the end of the day, how can you help practitioners who are in the trenches treating diverse populations do it differently? Give us your thoughts on that. And if you can't give us your thoughts on that, then we don't move that paper forward. Just wanted to know your thoughts.
So I mean, I think that's a very relevant question in terms of, are we really making having an impact on not only on the research field, but also in the practical field, and changing what we do. I mean, I think that a little bit by changing the discussion, we can contribute to that. I'm not sure that that's enough, and I'm not sure that I have a bigger answer to say, this is what we should do to really translate it to the practitioner. But I'm happy to talk to you later and see if you have some ideas and see what we can do to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, Jose. Great presentation. Mabel Chu from The Lancet. You mentioned the fact that journals are powerful agents for change. And one of the things that The Lancet we're trying to do to break down these structural barriers is, for instance, at the decision-making stage, or indeed at the I'm sorry, jet lag, Sydney, Australia. The initial evaluation stage, shall I say. We don't proceed with an article if it's about a minoritized group particularly, and the authorship has no one from that minoritized group or country, low middle income country. And same with reviewers, we make sure that we get reviewers with that background. Is this something that was part of your thinking at all?
It's not part of the EDI editor's role at this point, but it's something that we do look into and that we take into account. I don't think that we are rejecting papers if they don't have anyone from the minoritized group. Partly also, we have no real way, and this is a struggle we're having now, is how do we identify from the authors and even from the reviewer perspective, who's in what group, right? Because this is a self-described, how do you categorize yourself? And then even when looking at an international setting, the groups are different, right? And you know, when we look, for example, at the issue of do you face adversity because you belong to a minoritized group? I always give the example of how do you measure that, right? I come from Mexico, but I come from Mexico, fortunately, from a socioeconomic stratus where I was never a marginalized group, right? I became a Hispanic the day I came to the US. Before that, I was not a Hispanic. Then I become part of a minoritized group. But even then, my experience is completely different. You know, I'm a professor at Georgetown with someone who grows up in East LA or here in Chicago, some areas of Chicago. So how do you take all that into account? So at the moment, we're not doing that, implementing that at this.
Context is everything, and I must admit it's not as easy as it's made out to be.
Right.
Well, thank you, Jose.